Well, maybe it's ungracious, but I have to add one qualification to what Amy just said. I do sometimes get mentioned in the New York Times. In fact, just a couple of days ago, there was an op-ed which was one of the standard tantrums about how awful the 1960s were, and they were pretty awful. They really civilized the country. That's pretty dangerous. But I was mentioned as one of the last stale holdovers, still peddling that 1960s line that governments and corporations play some role in global planning. You know, real heresy. It's not the exact words that were used, but that's what they meant. So if you don't mind some stale holdovers, I'll go on with that heresy today. There's lots of articles in the press and the journals, the foreign policy journals, these last couple of weeks, trying to evaluate the first year of President Obama's foreign policy, what was achieved, what the problems are, and so on. One of the longest and most detailed ones was in the journal National Interest by Richard Burt, a well-known policy analyst, and among other things, he compared Obama with George Bush #1, the first Bush. The first Bush was criticized because he lacked what was called the vision thing. Obama, on the other hand, but Burt said, you know, in practice, he very successful, but lacked vision. Obama, he suggests, is sort of the opposite. Grand vision, real vision of what should be done, but he hasn't succeeded much in practice. And in fact, both Bush and Obama have accepted that designation, not doing well. But George Bush the first agreed. He said, "Yeah," he said, "I'm not into vision. He's into doing things." And Obama, when he was came under some criticism when he appointed his economic advisors because they were all drawn from people who'd helped engineer the financial crisis that was consuming the economy. He said, "Yes, it's true. I'm getting experts in the economy, but you don't have to worry because I'll provide the vision." Okay, well, we can see where that led. On the foreign policy, let's then keep to the vision, the admirable part. My favorite newspaper, the London Financial Times, a couple of days ago, identified Obama's major foreign policy problem today as Iran. The occasion for the article was Hillary Clinton's failure to convince Brazil to go along with the United States on calling for harsher sanctions, and President Lula's insistence that there should be engagement with Iran, commercial relations, and so on, and that it has a right to enrich uranium for producing nuclear energy, as do all signers of the Non-proliferation Treaty. Well, it was reported here too, of course, and Lula's position was considered sort of paradoxical. Why is he not going along with the international community, with the world? That's an interesting usage, which is a very striking reflection of the depth of the culture of imperialism. Who is the international community? Well, it turns out, if you look, that the international community is Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at the moment. The rest are not part of the world. They're kind of in opposition. Well, in this case, Lula's position happens to be that of most of the world. You can think it's right or wrong or whatever, but just as a matter of fact, for example, it's the position of the former non-aligned countries, the majority of countries of the world, and the large majority of their populations, they have repeatedly and vigorously supported Iran's right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, reiterating that it's a signer of the Non-proliferation Treaty, which does grant that right. So they're not part of the world. Another group that's not part of the world is the population of the United States. The last polls that I've seen a couple of years ago, in those polls, a considerable majority of Americans agreed that Iran has a right to develop nuclear energy, but of course not nuclear weapons. And in fact, as the poll demonstrated, the opinions of Americans on this issue were almost identical with opinions of Iranians on a whole range of issues. And in fact, when the poll was presented in Washington at a press conference, the presenter pointed out that if people were able to make policy, could be that these tensions and conflicts would be resolved. Well, that was a few years ago. Since then, there's been a huge mass of propaganda about the threat of Iran and so on, and it's very likely, I would guess, that if the poll were taken today, those figures for the American population would be different. But that was 2007, 3 years ago. So at that point, Americans were not part of the world. Most of the majority of people of the world were not part of the world. And Lula, by repeating their view, is also not part of the world. Could be added that he's almost surely the most popular political figure in the world, but that doesn't mean anything either. So what about the conflict with Iran and the threat of Iran? Nobody in their right mind wants Iran to develop nuclear weapons, or anyone for that matter. So on that, there's complete agreement. And in fact, there are significant problems about a proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's not a joke. And Obama's vision forcibly includes, stresses the need to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons and to reduce or maybe remove nuclear weapons. Well, that's the vision. What's the practice? Well, the practice became clear a couple of months ago. Once again, the Security Council passed a resolution, 1887, I think it was October, calling on, with a criticism of Iran for not living up to commitments that were demanded by the Security Council, and also calling on all states to join the Non-proliferation Treaty and to solve all their conflicts within the framework of the Non-proliferation Treaty without any threats of force. Well, that particular part of the resolution was not exactly headlined here for a simple reason. It was directed at two countries, the two countries that are regularly threatening the use of force, the United States and Israel. The threat of force is in violation of the UN Charter, if anybody cares about that stale old stuff, even older than the 60s. But that's never mentioned. But just across the spectrum here, almost everyone insists that the usual phrase is, we must keep all options open. That's a threat of force. And the threat of force is not just idle. So, for example, Israel is sending its nuclear submarines into the Gulf, firing distance. They're undetectable, basically, into areas where they could fire nuclear missiles. Of course, Israel has plenty of nuclear weapons. Fire them at Iran. The U.S. and others, or its allies, are carrying out field operations, exercises plainly aimed at Iran. There's a little hitch because Turkey is refusing to go along, but that's what they've been trying to do. So they're regular threats, verbal and in policy. Israel actually is sending the